And we should. Watching the little bar fill up. This is the just tedious portion of these online programs that we're doing. All right, we are all set. I'm gonna hit record in the Zoom as well. And we're ready to go. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Vermont Historical Society's Third Thursday program today. We are delighted to welcome back two historians and authors that have a long-time association with the Vermont Historical Society and are the authors of the Vermont Historical Society's most recent publication, which they joined me in July when we launched the book into the world. It's been selling very well since then, and perhaps this program today will inspire you to purchase it for yourself or for a loved one for the holidays upcoming. It's definitely a good sort of winter cozy up read and really put your mind to learning some really carefully done history. So I'm delighted to be welcomed today by Nick Muller and Gary Shattuck, who are the authors of that publication, whose full title is The Rebel and the Tory, Ethan Allen, Philip Skene, and the Dawn of Vermont. So they're going to speak today about the research that went into that book, some exciting new primary sources that they used to rewrite some of the narratives that we took for granted around Vermont history, frame that moment in Vermont history. Who is Philip Skene? You may be asking yourself. They're on a quest to restore him to his proper place in Vermont history. And reflect a little bit on what all of this story teaches us about the story of Vermont. So with that probably overly wordy introduction, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Nick and Gary.
Thank you, Amanda. There is a third author on the book, and it's John Duffy. And John didn't survive the process, but he started the process. And he called me in March of 2017 and said, how do we know that the Connecticut attorney, Jared Ingersoll, was present at the ejectment trials? Well, I've been reading about those trials and everything that I had read about early Vermont. And they always told the same story. And so I answered glibly and naively, well, we get the court records and look and see whether Mr. Ingersoll, Attorney Ingersoll, was there. John had found two other Ingersolls practicing in the area, and he wanted to make sure it was Jared. I found out only through serendipity that the records had not really been opened before, that they were in the 7th and 8th floor of a courthouse that Boss Tweed had built in New York City, and they were being transferred to Albany. In contact with the archivist in Albany, asked him what he had on these 9 ejectment trials. That was what every account said. There were 9 trials of greedy New Yorkers and their somewhat slippery attorneys using the New York court system to try to eject poor Vermont settlers, in those days, grant settlers, from their small farms. He said that they're very difficult to transmit to you because they're on scrolls. But he had a few of the scrolls photocopied and mailed them to me. And I looked at them. And John Duffy and I exchanged telephonic high fives. We have found the mother lode here. We're going to revise everything. How good that I copied the archivist, because he wrote back very politely, Dr. Muller, you don't know how to read those. And he saved me a real embarrassment. But I knew an individual who did know how to read them. His name is Gary Shattuck, and you can see him. He is an attorney who had been a state trooper in Vermont, who had been an assistant district attorney, who went on to become an assistant U.S. attorney for the state of Vermont, and had done a good deal of work. And it also helped write the historic preservation laws that had to do with the preservation of historic materials, particularly those found in Lake Champlain. So John Duffy and I turned to Gary and asked him to help, and he got started. What he found, and he can tell you in a minute, was that there were not 9 trials, there were 19. They happened over 2 years. The New York court was extremely well managed. They were not trying to eject Vermonters. That's not what ejectment meant. They were only trying to establish their title. At the same time, I had been involved with Fort Ticonderoga and knew that there was a large collection of Skeen material there. And he was the most important man, I thought, in the Champlain Valley in the 1760s and early 1770s. And he disappeared. He was not even in the index of the very good 1-volume history the Vermont Historical Society put out called Freedom and Unity. What's going on? So I was going to go look at those papers. Gary said, don't bother. He takes his camera, photographs them all, brings them home on his computer and can read them. I would go look with my pen and pencil, write down what I thought I was reading, mostly make little errors, and they would appear later. So Gary, would you like to talk a little bit about what you found in those and where it went?
Well, thank you, Nick. Yeah, it was quite a revelation when you gave a call and asked if I could help out on what it is you and John were working on. I had been working on my master's thesis on the Vermont Constitution, and part of that had to do with looking at the court records here in the New Hampshire Grants, and trying to get a handle on this issue called ejectment, because Ethan Allen had screamed so much about how the perfidious New Yorkers were throwing everybody off the land, and to justify his ill treatment of the settlers. And I just couldn't find it as I was looking at the county court records in Cumberland, Gloucester, and in Charlotte County. I did not find.
To interrupt, those are Cumberland and Gloucester, the counties along the Connecticut River.
Right, established in 1768 and 1770. Albany, they were carved out of Albany County. And, but I did find some ejectment matters in Albany on the county level. And as we were talking before we came online here, ejectment was not so much to throw someone off the land as it was for a landowner to establish his title, to verify it, because so much was in flux at the time. Ejectment could have been a result, but it was not the primary focus of these trials that Ethan Allen screamed about. But anyway, with that prior knowledge about the county courts, when you found the Supreme Court records, which I had tried to get maybe a short time before you and was told they were virtually inaccessible down in Manhattan, you worked your magic and they were coming back up to Albany to the archives in Albany. So I traveled over there and looked at the Supreme Court records, and it was just as soon as opening up the docket book and seeing these cases, there were 18 cases that were listed with, 19 cases in total. And as you mentioned, the prior history only said that there were several. And this was a much bigger story than what the last 250 years had written about. So working with the New York archives there was able to get the individual cases. You talked about these scrolls, which was very interesting. These were roughly 6 inches wide by maybe 4 or 5 feet long, where plaintiffs' attorneys would record the information of a case on it. And it was all bound up in a scroll and stuck in a pigeonhole. And that's how the court clerks kept it. But they unwound these things. There were stacks of them. And fortunately, they were able to index some of those that they could read. And fortunately, they came up with some of the cases that were essentially the founding documents for Vermont. The Small v. Carpenter case is the one that everybody cites, and that case was there, and we pulled it. And I was able to read it and transcribe it. It's in the book. But in looking at that, we at least established the scope of this. It was a much bigger story. There was much more to it and worth getting into and trying to find all the cases we could. And then just out of fortune, I did a search of the New York Historical Society website. And there was, down in Manhattan, there was a very brief entry that there was information about John Tabor Kemp, the Attorney General for New York, all of his cases. And I asked him to send me that inventory of his cases, and it was about 90 pages long. And within there were a half a dozen cases that matched the ones from the Albany archives. So I was able to get that, and it just all exploded from that point on. Once we got the John Tabor Kemp papers, we could now pry back the curtain and see what it is Ethan Allen was screaming about, and how professional and how competent the New York courts were, and how unbiased the attorneys were, whether it was Kemp or Duane, or the two judges, Robert Livingston, or Duncan Ledlow, and the two excellent attorneys representing the settlers.
Defendant, yeah.
Ingersoll, that you were talking about, that John Duffy was asking about, was one of them. So, and then traveled on to New Haven Museum, where I found the Ingersoll papers, which established that he was going to be there. So just by asking a simple question that John did, was Jared Ingersoll a part of this? With a little bit of work, we were able to expose a great many people, a great many cases. It was a much bigger story than the simple couple of sentences and the disparagement that Ethan Allen was trying to give in his brief narrative, and that Ira adopted, and all historians since then, essentially.
It leads to, it led me at least after a while, because I had made the error, I had parroted the story that had been told from the time that Williamson and Ira Allen told it in 1798 until the most recent work in the 21st century on Allen, or on the state of Vermont. And why is it that for 200 and some years, nobody found or looked for these court records? They could have. But that we have no evidence that anybody other than one professor from Brooklyn College got into at least one of those records, but didn't understand or care what he was looking at. He was using it for a different reason. Why do we do that? And there is really a huge volume of contemporary records of primary sources available to challenge many of the perceptions of the history of the state of Vermont, which have come down from the generations and are part of the bloodstream of Vermonters and this perception of themselves. It's an important question. For example, Vermont Constitution, everybody knows that the 1777 Constitution was the first government document, state constitution, to outlaw slavery, or at least stop it after women got to be 18 and men got to be 16, or maybe it was the reverse. And Amani Whitfield at the University of Vermont, and working with the Vermont Historical Society, published a book called The Problem of Slavery in Early Vermont that just exploded that myth. We had slaves. Ethan Allen may have had slaves. His brother had a slave. His daughter brought 2 slaves back from Alabama who lived with him in Burlington into the 1840s. How did that story get never looked at?
Nick,
Gary has, Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. We have a quick question from someone in attendance that I think is very much along your line of thought right now. He's asking if we have based so much of the narrative of early Vermont on Ethan Allen's version of it. What would you say motivated Ethan Allen to tell that specific version of the story? Why was
Gary
Allen?
and I can jump in on this because we're pretty sure we know. The trials were in 1770 and 1771 in June. That's when the Supreme Court met in, they called it the April session, but took place in June each year. And in 1773, James Duane, a very prominent attorney who had been involved in these cases, wrote a book about them. It was published. It came out in 1773, and it made Ethan Allen look pretty bad. And Ethan wrote his narrative, published that in the Hartford Courant, and then after he was let go from his British captivity in 1779, published the same book really, called The Vindication. He was essentially defending his own reputation and trying to dish dirt really on the Yorkers. Gary, you want to expound on that?
Well, as we demonstrate in the book there, I think part of the motivation of Ethan had to do with the neglect that is attributed to him in the way the evidence was accumulated to represent the settlers during the trial, because we know that his own attorney said that he was acting out of ignorance and had not procured the documents that he was instructed to get from John Wentworth in Portsmouth. And so Ethan was not referred to by name in the court, but the court, his attorneys said in open court during the 1770 trial that our evidence is deficient because of ignorance. It was procured out of ignorance, which by implication means Ethan. So when Duane writes this report to the Crown, essentially in 1773, that's when we have Ethan retaliating in 1774 with his brief narrative that you mentioned. And Duane—
The brief narrative was only 200 pages long.
Exactly. In 73, Duane recounts the fact that he doesn't cite Ethan's name, but everybody knows it's Ethan. And he says that it was the reason the settlers lost was because of the way they conducted or gathered their evidence. So Ethan responds in 74 with his brief narrative and then with the vindication in 79. So, you know, where does this come from? The questioner asked, is it based upon maybe Ethan's reputation? You know, he became, well, as you know, Nick, I mean, you and John wrote Inventing Ethan Allen, and where the myth of Ethan came from in the 1800s. You know, that there was this grasping for an identity essentially for the state. So, I mean, I think that's my take on why historians have been enamored with Ethan. It's out of all proportion to his contributions at the time, to my mind. And let's not forget that afterwards, he went off and was negotiating with Skeen to create this 14th colony. So he had other motivations along with his land company up on the Onion River. So, and he, you know, he was shunned by the town fathers when he tried to get a command after taking Fort Ticonderoga. He didn't get a command. So he had a real reputational issue going on there in the mid-70s that I think began with his conduct during the trials.
We do have another question that I think speaks to some of your research as well, and maybe some of why historians have been relying on Ethan Allen's narrative for so long, which is, have the scrolls that you looked at been digitized, and are they accessible online or in any other way other than in person?
There is a single one that I'm aware of that's available online. It's at the Vermont State Archives, and it is that Small versus Carpenter case that I talked about, the one that everybody cites Vermont historians cite too. It's kind of difficult to read, but I did a lot of work with my digital camera, and I was able to take pictures of these things and bring them back on my computer and try and, blow them up and clarify and read them. So at least with a small v. Carpenter case, we're able to get the wording down. It's a little complicated because you have to understand what ejectment law was about, what the elements of the law were. We cite all this in the book. We don't have to go into it, but for a layman to just read it and trying to get something out of it, you need to look at more in order to understand what that document reads, the context of it.
That's exactly right. When I wrote the letter to Duffy and did the telephone call to him, I was shocked to see that every one of the cases that the archives had sent to me had the same plaintiff. It was Peter Quiet. He was the one that was suing the Vermonters. And the reason they put Peter Quiet there is that the ejectment law, which came from I've learned all this from Gary, which came from the Cromwellian times, had 6 different things that had to be performed. And simply getting the name Peter Quiet as a pseudonym got them past the first 3 elements of the proceedings that were required. So when you look at these cases, Peter Quiet, who was a Thompson, there were 3 different names, did all of the suits.
Yeah, there are a number of names that you use. It seems unusual to us, but at the time, they used a fiction. They identified people in the complaints in these lawsuits by a fiction. And Peter Quiet stood in for a plaintiff. And John Stiles stood in for a defendant. It was a feudal law. And remember, this is just before the Revolution. And it was very complicated, the application of English law here in the colonies, along with the interpretation by the individual colonies themselves versus how the crown wished these things to be interpreted. So there was nothing untoward by using fictive names in there. In fact, Alexander Hamilton admits that it was a very effective way and very widely understood method of doing these ejectment cases.
So we have another question from, we've got a very busy and engaged audience today that I think will get us into these ejectment cases a little bit more. And the question is, did the Vermonters lose all 19 cases, and what did that result in happening? So what happened after the cases themselves? So I wonder if you could sort of frame the cases for us a little bit and tell us the results of them and then what happened.
What was the famous case involving Brackenridge, the farmer down in Bennington, who was one of the cases. Then it was Small v. Carpenter, and then there were 2 other cases. There were 4 cases that were tried in June of 1770. The outcome of those all went against the settlers because of various reasons. We describe it in the book, but essentially they were not able to prove that they had received grants of land. I mean, they knew that this was going to be the proof they had to come up with, and that's what Ethan was sent to Portsmouth to get the information on, and he failed to do. So if you can't meet your burden to show evidence that you had a right to the land, you're going to lose it. So they lost those 4 cases in June of 1770. The balance, a number of the other cases took place in June of 1771, and the settlers had an entire year to correct this problem, and they didn't. And the attorney that they used in the first trials refused to represent them in the second trial because of their neglect and refusal to get the evidence, or inability to get the evidence for that matter. And they lost those. And the bottom line is these landlords received legal title, a finding by the jury that they won their case. But that doesn't mean that the people were thrown off the land. When you get an award from the jury, it meant that the successful plaintiff then took that award and went to a court and got a writ of execution from the court, who was issued to the sheriff to go out and evict people from the land. And it was when an eviction consisted of removing a person from the property in order to comply with feudal law. And then if it could be negotiated, they would return the possession of the land to the defaulting person. They were not necessarily thrown off the land. So that's what happened. All in all, they lost all the cases. But the bigger question is, were they justified in then marching off and creating the Green Mountain Boys and then harassing those people who had legitimate title to the land? Nick, is there legitimacy to the Green Mountain Boys and what happened, I mean, right after the trials?
Well, the Allens had different purposes.
Yes.
The trials themselves the plaintiffs only went for as defendants, as people who were settling on the land and presumably trespassing. The Allens, on the other hand, had with the Onion River Land Company in 1772, were buying huge numbers of acres of lands in towns, particularly in northern Vermont, particularly along the Winooski River, or the Onion River, as they called their land company, the Onion River Land Company. They understood that if the settlers lost, their own titles weren't any good. And they had not only whatever fortune they had, but their prospects for the future tied up in those titles. And the Green Mountain Boys were essentially a way for the Allens and the people who supported them to harass New York authority and to prevent New York authority from exercising its authority in the grants, particularly those west of the mountains. On the other side of the mountains, numbers of people were happy about the New York. New York had brought a system in that was building roads and helping the infrastructure. And they converted their New Hampshire titles into New York titles. It cost them some money. The Allens didn't have the money to do that either. So I don't know, Gary, these trials have always been reported in Vermont's history as corrupt, aristocratic, well-connected, somewhat venal lawyers coming after poor Vermont settlers or grant settlers. And it was not an even playing field in a variety of ways. And that was sold not only to the settlers at the time, producing the anti-New York stuff in the conventions that led to the independence statement of Vermont in 1777. But it's been sold for all the generations of Vermonters that follow.
The other thing that comes out of this is an extension of our story and relying on the primary sources has to do with Philip Skene. And Nick mentioned the wealth of information at Fort Ticonderoga, which was very helpful in this. Because right after the trial's loss, Skene was a friend of Allen. He was a former British soldier who owned the land called Skenesboro, today's current Whitehall, New York. And Skene very much acted as a middleman to try and help Allen and the settlers with the New York authorities. He was a county judge in Charlotte County, established in 1772. And that's where we start to see a revival of the attempt to create a new colony, which Skene was involved with and Jeffrey Amherst back in 1759, which was the start of an idea to create a new colony. And so Skene worked with Allen to try, and other people down in southern Vermont, to try and create this separate colony, get permission to carve out a large portion of northern New York to create this colony, which would essentially, with Skeen as the governor, the lieutenant governor, in a position to be able to appoint authorities that would, including court officials, that would help to resolve these title issues and put peace to the territory. And so do you want to talk about the Skeen papers at Fort Ty?
Well, they're not nearly as large as the ejectment trial papers, but it demonstrates, one, that Skeen had been orphaned and had gone to Ireland and lived with his uncle, who revered. His uncle got him involved with the army. He ended up in coming to the Lake Champlain area in 1758 and participating in that failed attempt by Abercrombie to take Fort Ticonderoga, at which the British were badly beaten. He was there the next year when Amherst's army drove the French out of Carillon, as they called it, or Fort Ticonderoga. And Skeen proved to be not only a good military leader, but a brave and virtuous man. And Amherst, who was the head of the military, British military in North America, came to really like Skeen and promoted him as a governor of a new colony that would be south of Quebec and north of roughly the Crown Point Road, going from the Green Mountains and the Connecticut River all the way west to Lake Ontario. And that darn near happened until New York got a whiff of it, and it got pushed around in the British government. But following the ejectment trials and with the title issues not resolved, Skeen, Allen, and others, leaders on the grants, decided that maybe the best plan was to form a new colony and remove New York from the picture. And Skeen, in fact, got the commission to be governor of this new colony. He got it in February of 1776. He was on his way back on a ship called the Charming Sally when it was pulled up on the Grand Banks on the south side of Newfoundland, where the cod fisheries were. And they brought a captain of a Narragansett schooner aboard to talk and have a drink. And that captain of the schooner informed Skeen, and is the captain of the Charming Sally, that Ethan Allen had taken Ticonderoga, that the Green Mountain Boys had sacked Skeen's estate. They had taken his wife's coffin, which removed all the lead and took the jewels out of it, made bullets out of the lead, and it captured his son and the other people working there. Skeen and him is taken prisoner. When he comes back into Philadelphia in June of 1775. The Second Continental Congress is waiting for him. Their spies in England were very good, and they got faster information on the packets than they did on the British warships. They knew that Skeen was coming, and he was coming with a commission for a new colony, and he was coming with a commission to lead a regiment of 1,000 men. And he also was given money to try to bribe the New York authorities to keep them thinking about the British Empire as opposed to the new United States. He was arrested. Who else was there in June of 1775? Ethan Allen and Seth Warner had traveled to Philadelphia to try to promote the campaign against Canada. They talked to the Continental Congress on the 23rd of June. There's no way these two good friends, both on parole, well, one loose, Allen and Warner, the other on parole, did not meet in Philadelphia. It's a very interesting story. Skeen eventually gets released or paroled and then exchanged. And at the time he's exchanged, Ethan Allen is back in New York City, having been freed by the British from his captivity. And they meet. Allen talks about it in his narrative of the capture of Ethan Allen. At this point, Skeen tries to recruit Allen, tries to get him to turn sides, tells him he'll go to England and they'll see the king. And Skeen was the only one with capacity to get somebody in front of the king. He'd already demonstrated that. But Allen said no, and did not use his name in his narrative, but it's very clear who it was. And we researched that point and approached it. We can't prove positive, but we indicate the reasons why it's probable. Have I gone on too long, Gary?
No, you're fine. No, and we used a
Skeen
lot
is
of
really important.
it really was. And what helped to flesh it out was the primary documents from Fort Ticonderoga of the Skeen papers. There are also a number of them also at the Bennington Museum, and they helped to flesh out some of the goings on that Skeen was involved with.
Skeen was an important man. He was. So I wonder, I think that the next question from our audience ties in a bit with what you were talking about with Skeen's negotiations to create this new colony, which is the question is, does any of your research make you reconsider the Haldeman negotiations that the Allens were involved in to potentially those maneuverings about making Vermont a state? Does anything in your research sort of shed any light on that, or are they connected at all, or do you think those are two separate historical incidents?
I would call them separate but related. I have published a number of things where I have essentially said I believe that the Haldeman negotiations were serious. The Allens would have, and with Chittenden and with the Fays and the others that were part of their coterie, would have happily returned to the British Empire under certain conditions, which was essentially to run their own show. But they wanted this Richelieu River and the St. Lawrence River and the capacity to send product to England and to Canada. And they worked on that even after the Haldeman negotiations. But the rest of the state, most of it, did not agree. You think of the population of Vermont in 1775, 6, and 7, when it becomes independent, less than 10,000 people. When it became a state in 1791, that census showed 89,000 plus. That's a huge growth. And where did those people come from? Well, there was some natural increase, but basically they were migrants from other states. They were not put off by being part of the United States. They had come from the United States. They supported it. And after the next thing I'm working on right now is the coup that the folks who favored statehood got Chittenden out of the governor's office in 1789, got their statehood stuff moving to the point where it couldn't be stopped, and didn't get in the way his returning to be governor in 1790. it's an interesting story, I think.
More to come.
But on the Howell negotiations, there's a book called A Band of Vagabonds, published by David Bennett of the University of Ottawa. And David's did I think the best research that's been done on the East Union and the West Union and how they were broken up, and on the Howell negotiations. But the Howell negotiations in themselves deserve a really thoughtful and well-researched monograph.
Great.
And that's the one I'm not going to probably do.
Well, that's a good call out to someone out there who's finding this
Well,
fascinating.
I know Kevin Graffinino thinks it should be done. I'd love to get him going on it.
Yeah, that would be great. So we have a couple more questions, and we have a couple people, attendees who have have used the hand raise function. Just a quick reminder, if that means you have a question, to please use either the Q&A function or the chat box to ask your questions. Another question on how your new work and your new research might change or frame other narratives. We have Laurel is asking, does this new info change much in the book that Robert Mello wrote about Moses Robinson? Does that change any of that narrative or reflect on that narrative?
May I call him Bob?
Sure.
I really like his Moses Robinson book. And I don't think the reviewers really understood quite how good it was. He doesn't get around to talking about a coup. That word is a little strong. But he will probably be part of the group with whom I work when we produce this book on Vermont's movement to statehood in the late 1770s and 1780s. We've run in recently to a German's work that's fascinated me, and nobody has done anything like it. He got into the probate records of the estates of people in Bennington County and across on the Connecticut River, what's Windham County now, but was Cumberland County for part of that time. And he takes the point of view that Vermont was a developing place where people came, largely young people came to establish a farm. But you don't do that without credit. And there were no banks. There were no land banks. And you borrowed money from people you knew, people who had money to loan. You borrowed it for seeds and livestock and tools and things, iron things, hinges for windows and shutters and barn doors. And these probate records show a huge number of debtors to the people who died. I've looked recently at Chittenden's probate record. Over 100 people owed him money. Most of it was really small. It was done in pounds and pence and pounds and 6 pounds, 2 pence, and somebody's shillings. But there were two in there who were different. One was Ira Allen. He owed Chittenden 222 pounds plus a few shillings. The other was his son-in-law, Matthew Lyon. Now you wonder, who owed Chittenden, his father-in-law, 400 pounds plus. You begin to wonder how the political nexus works around these debts. You would go to borrow from relatives. You would borrow from people in the same church. You would borrow from your neighbors. And the people who were loaning the money, I think, had a good deal of political sway over who voted for whom in the elections of the 1780s. That's where I'm kind of going with this stuff. If will I get there, I don't know, but trying to do it, and I've got Bob Mello and Gary interested in this. And if we can ever get into a Vermont restaurant, we're going to have some lunch and do some interesting talk.
I think we definitely look forward to hearing more about that. Ellen has asked just a quick question back to the ejectment trials. If there were 19 trials, does that mean there were only 19 Vermonters in potential jeopardy of losing their land, or did they represent larger pools of people?
No, there were 18 defendants and 19 cases. Breckenridge had 2 brought against him. Also, I would point out at the same time, the judge, Robert Livingston, was also a defendant in an ejectment case that took place at the very same time as these ejectment trials, which is an interesting story in and of itself, which we talk about in the book.
I think the answer, the one word answer to the question is yes. Not every Grants settler had a case, became a defendant. But they all knew that if they lost these cases, they didn't have much of a claim to the validity of their own title, of the titles on which they were living and working.
And aside from the Breckenridge farm incident, there were no attempts to eject people. Well, I take it back. There were 2 others in Manchester that ended up peacefully, where the sheriff went up and dispossessed the people under feudal law, but then put them back into possession of the property. So aside from those very few incidents, no, they did not lose their land because the Green Mountain Boys arose and they attacked any New Hampshire or New York constable or sheriff that thought he might be able to get away with coming and exercising an execution in the Grants. So no, they were not dispossessed. That's
and the landlords themselves wanted those settlers there.
Right, they weren't trying to eject them. They needed the land improved to comply with Crown rulings that they wanted the resources exploited. So they had no benefit to kick people off the land.
But they were going to exact rent, basically, for being on the land.
Right, they didn't have an fee simple, which is what the New England settlers had, in which they had such a difficult time dealing with the landlord situation that New York had. So we had a butting of heads of 2 legal systems taking place also here.
Great, thank you.
I'm enjoying the questions, Amanda.
Good. We have a really, thank you to everyone who asked a question. We have a really engaged audience today, which is great. John says this is all very fascinating. And he would like to know why Ethan Allen ended up getting arrested and what's the story around that.
Arrested or captured?
I think we captured.
Well, he also got arrested back in Massachusetts and in Northampton, but he was captured. He expected to be the colonel or the lieutenant colonel of the Green Mountain Regiment that the Continental Congress asked New York to establish. And New York said they gave the people on the grants the authority to establish their own officers. And they came back and had a meeting in Dorset. And Ethan Allen wanted to be the colonel, but I think he got less than 10 votes. Seth Warner got the bulk of the rest of them. Ethan wanted to go badly, wanted to take part in the invasion of Canada. He went to see Philip Skene, who was the leader of that. Schuyler didn't like him, but he eventually agreed that if Allen would agree to behave himself, he could go along as a civilian scout. Allen went north with that, recruited some Canadians and some Indians, and was scouting along the St. Lawrence River when he decided that it was possible to cross the St. Lawrence from La Prairie and attack Montreal, which was not well defended. Later, it has been written, first time, I think, Gary, in Ira Allen's history of the state, that Seth Warner had met with Ethan on the banks of the St. Lawrence and decided to also attack from another direction across the St. Lawrence. But Seth Warner never answered the bugle call or whatever it was. And Ethan was on the Montreal Island with a ragtag group of basically Canadians and Indians. And the Brits came out and defeated him.
Put him in
quickly.
captivity for a couple of years. Yeah.
And they captured him. And he went to Quebec and into a ship to Pendarvis Castle, Portsmouth, England. Spent time there. Then went to Ireland and came to Halifax. From Halifax to South Carolina in a troop ship, and from South Carolina in that troop ship back as a captive in New York City. He was paroled on Long Island. He wasn't supposed to come into the city, but he did, and he got caught. And so he was put in the, trying to think of the name of the jail he was in, but still was fairly liberally able to get around the town. He was arrested for attacking Montreal as a civilian, or captured. And incidentally, it was a problem because he never held a commission in the Continental Army. And how could the Brits exchange for him if he wasn't an officer? And that took a long while to work out, and George Washington was involved in that. Eventually, he was exchanged in the 1778, 78, 77, 77. He repaired to Valley Forge, and from there, from Valley Forge, came north to Bennington with Horatio Gates in May of 1777. Does that respond to the question?
I think it does. That's quite a lot of traveling going on for Ethan there. Thank you. We do have another question. Wondering if your research and this conception of the narrative adds any nuance to the legacy of Benedict Arnold, who of course is sort of involved in this story around this time as well. Potentially not.
Not really. Haven't concentrated on Arnold. The second volume of Nathaniel Phil, I was reading part of that book again this morning. Philbrick, trilogy on the Revolution. It's called Valiant Ambition, and essentially tries to interpret the middle stage of the Revolution through the eyes and machinations of Arnold and Washington. And I think that's a pretty good book. Neither really one of my books with John or work with Gary has really concentrated on Arnold.
I think he's one of those historical figures who has gotten quite a lot more nuance in maybe the last 25 or 50 years. You know, you never would have.
Well, he was persona non grata until Kenneth Roberts in the early 30s started to write his books, his novels, where Arnold was the hero.
No, absolutely.
Arnold liked money a little too much, I think.
Well, that goes to some of your thesis about so much of the early politicking being driven by debt, right?
Yep.
We have another question. Did the number they're putting here is 30,000 that Vermonters paid New Yorkers upon statehood and entry into the US go to the people who won the ejectment trials? So when Vermont became part of the United States, they did pay fees towards New York, was that connected to the ejectment trials? Did it go to the people who had won the ejectment trials, or was that a separate fee?
I don't know that you'd say it went directly to them as for the results of the ejectment trial, but because of investments that some of the landlords made in the Grants area, yes, there were a number of people that did receive compensation from that $30,000. It was
But not
spread
every-
out. I don't remember the number of claimants, but it was by no means all went to the landlords. There were many investors in the grants, and that includes Samuel and John Adams, who invested in the grants. Not that they got some of the 30,000, but it just shows you how attractive the land was to outside speculators, including the Adams family.
Thank you. So it is now 12:58, which means we've wrapped up a very lively hour of questions and conversation. Thank you both. The last thing I want to just do is, Nick, you've given us a preview of your next work. Gary, you've just published a new book. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your new book to close out our conversation today.
Sure, that was done in conjunction with the Center for Research on Vermont. It's called By the Wand of Some Magician, Embracing Modernity in Mid-19th Century Vermont. It's a mouthful to just say that there was a substantial shift in the way that Vermont culture was dealing with modernity in around 1850, right about the time the railroad arrived. And I talk about the effects of the railroad and the introduction of all these outside goods and concepts and how it changed Vermont culture for the next several years. So it was an interesting exercise, and that's about all I got to say. I got to read the book. Get it from the Center for Research on Vermont.
From a distance, this is an example. If you read most of the literature about Vermont in the decade of the 1850s, when the rest of the country was booming in terms of population growth, and Vermont grew at smaller than 1 million people. Why did Vermont population growth come to a halt in that decade?
Smaller than 1,000. Yeah, it was very small.
The usual interpretation, aside from in-migration and out-migration, is that Vermont was starting to experience a long winter. It's called the Winter of Vermont. And that theory about the next 50, 60 years really permeates much of the literature on Vermont, historical literature. Paul Searles has begun to change that. But what Gary has managed to do was find a variety of sources that have previously not been looked at. And based on these primary sources, he tells a very different story of the livelihood of the state and some of the issues of the modernity, including how do you regulate railroads, which sure and heck needed it, at the same time you're coming out of a culture where the government shouldn't regulate anything. How do you really regulate medicine when the Vermont legislature doesn't want to regulate medicine? How do you regulate drugs? There's all kinds of issues that are important. And Gary has, really, as far as I know, nobody else has looked at the data that he has.
Great. Well, we can definitely urge everyone watching along, if you enjoyed this talk today and are a fan of Nick and Gary's research, to keep an eye out for Nick's new work and look for Gary's new book, By the Wand of Some Magician, now available through the Center for Research on Vermont. I also dropped links to the other 2 books that we discussed today, obviously the Rebel and the Tory book that Nick and Gary wrote along with John Duffy this past summer, and the book Robert Mello wrote on Moses Robinson that was also published by the Vermont Historical Society. So I dropped links to all of those in the chat. We've gotten a number of thank yous and comments that this was an excellent talk. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. We really appreciate both that you wrote the book for the Historical Society and that you were able to join us today to talk to us a little bit more about it. And we'll look forward to chatting with you both in the future, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you for those folks who asked us questions and those others who listened to us.
Yeah.
All right.